You are listening to Radio Maria Canada, a Catholic voice wherever you are. We now present The Bottomless Well, hosted by Father Scott Lewis.
Welcome, this is Father Scott Lewis, and you're listening to the Easter Vigil on the Bottomless Well. One of my favorite Jesus movies was the movie done by Zeffirelli, Jesus of Nazareth. It's an old film, but it never wears out. It never gets old. One scene that has stuck with me over the years is probably not what you would expect. It's not one of the great dramatic scenes. They're all on the road, and they're asleep one night by the campfire. Jesus is curled up blissfully asleep, and Peter and one of the other apostles are still awake. And the other apostle asked Peter, "What are you going to do when all of this is over?" And Peter says, "Well, I'm going to go home. I'm just going to pick up my life where I left off. I just want a normal life again." And the apostle says to Peter, "No, you're not, Peter. You're not going home. You're never going to go home again. And not only that, your life will never be the same again. And the world will never be the same again." And then looking over towards the sleeping Jesus, he says, because of him, that one solitary life, the world was never the same. It all began with the empty tomb. But many saw it but didn't understand it or didn't believe it. The empty tomb alone is not enough for faith. That many times it was their expectations were different, and so they really couldn't comprehend the great miracle that was unfolding in front of them. But think of it, would you have had the courage to run back to friends and family and tell them such a story, that the tomb was empty or that you had met the risen Jesus? They would have thought you're crazy. And especially poignant is the fact that the first witnesses were women. Their testimony would have been suspect in the eyes of many. Even today, accounts of close encounters of a mystical or spiritual nature are greeted with amusement and skepticism, and sometimes with downright hostility. Obviously, they or others related the story eventually, or we wouldn't be sitting here on Easter night celebrating the resurrection of the Lord. But the good news came perilously close to not getting off the ground. One thing we really have to understand, though, the resurrection was no easier to believe in the time of Jesus than it is now. Belief has always been difficult, and they did not live in a more credulous age or an unsophisticated age. In fact, they were closer to death. Death was an everyday reality for them, and they knew well that when you were dead, you stayed dead. But don't many of us do the same thing in a sense? We may nod our heads at the creed about he rose from the dead and so forth, but in a sense, we're like so many. We don't tell anyone because we're afraid. Our fear and our doubt not only prevent us from proclaiming the risen Christ to others, more importantly, it keeps us from proclaiming the message to ourselves. It's easy to talk about it in church. It's like preaching to the choir. But is the message delivered to the world in a credible manner? Try preaching the risen Lord today and see how far you get. But one thing that is kind of highlights the problem is that We always treat the resurrection as a doctrine, something to believe. But it's not something merely to believe in, an article of doctrine. We can be quite orthodox in our theology. We can memorize the creed forwards and backwards and really not have any faith at all. It must be experienced. It must be personally experienced and revealed or manifested in the world in which we live. Unless Christ is visibly risen in human communities and in human lives, then the whole Easter story is just the stuff of legend and myth. There has to be tangible proof, and the tangible proof is us, all of us. So we always have to ask ourselves, what kind of proof am I? Why does Easter seem to have so little effect on the world? And I mentioned that the world would never be the same, but, we still have wars, we still have injustice, we still have hatred and bigotry and so many things. Well, even in the Gospels, the disciples fight and squabble over who's the greatest. They don't understand Jesus, even though they're tagging along for the ride. They ask for privileged places at the right and the left of Jesus in his kingdom. And they remain rather thick-headed and uncomprehending at the attempts of Jesus to sketch a new world and a new way of living through his use of parable and story and symbolic action. And when Jesus is arrested, they flee in terror. They don't even want to be associated with his name. They don't want to be seen in his presence. Christianity is such a strange and uncompromising, unpromising beginning. In a sense, Jesus was and always will be a stranger in our world. And for that matter, a stranger in the church, even as we speak his name and depict him in art and liturgy and literature and theology. In a sense, he is a stranger to us in church. Why is that? Well, first of all, he does not play our games. And he does not buy into our values. He asks us to renounce power and honor and privilege and prestige. He asks us not to judge or exclude or label or hate other people. He loves unceasingly and unconditionally and asks us to do the same. He asks us not to cling fearfully to comfort or even to our lives, but to be willing to take risks for the sake of the kingdom. He asks us to be a sign of contradiction. In a world ruled by fear and hatred and greed and violence, he asks us to witness to peace by sharing, by exercising tolerance and forgiveness and inclusiveness and compassionate action. By raising Jesus from the dead, God made a statement. What God was saying was that everything that Jesus taught and did has divine approval. Jesus was right, and the world was and still is so wrong. After Easter, the first Christ followers believed that the world had radically changed, that it had been renewed and transformed. Well, the jury is still out on that. It remains to be seen what effect Christ has had on our world. It is still being worked out. But one thing is clear. We play a crucial role. We ask the question, in what sense has light triumphed over darkness? Why does there appear, at least, to be so much more darkness in our own time? Well, how can we proclaim Christ is risen while we're watching the evening news? That's exactly when we should be proclaiming it. Because we see that the wars continue to rage, injustice are continually perpetrated, and the hatred, fear, greed, and tribalism continue their corrosive work in our own time. There are times when it seems like we're not going forward, but going backwards. And then in our own time today, the present COVID-19 pandemic has brought out the best in many people, but it's also brought out the worst in others. It's brought out the worst in our governments. It's brought out the worst in human behavior sometimes, exhibited in extreme selfishness. In times of great trial, in times of great fear, people turn to demagogues and rabble-rousers and those who build walls rather than bridges. And so as we look around, we see that the world seems to have spiraled out of control. Well, we ask about the church. Well, the church has let down many, and its image has been severely damaged by human sin. Human sin and the lack of humility to come clean on it, to beg for forgiveness. And so what will be required is much humility, much renunciation, and a tremendous amount of conversion. In a sense, we have to take the risen Christ into our hearts. We have to allow the risen Christ to completely transform our lives, transform the way we think, transform the way we feel, transform our values. So we ask the question, do we make our faith in the risen Lord a tightly compartmentalized part of our lives, best confined to Sunday and clear overt religious activities? Or do we twist the message in a negative and fearful or divisive way? Do we use it to build walls between us and others? Do we use it to crush the life out of others? Do we use it to teach others that they should be very, very afraid of God? That depends on whether we have actually encountered the risen Lord. In Matthew, the women run smack dab into Jesus, and they encounter the risen Lord. In the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene runs back to the apostles and says, "I have seen the Lord." And the way they say it really communicates the fact that they are absolutely transformed. Their lives will never be the same. We need to experience the risen Christ, experience the resurrection, and not just believe in it. We could give the most eloquent testimony possible, and what would that be? A joyful life, marked by great kindness and generosity and profound gratitude, the ability to give and receive love. It can also be marked by an inner peace that is obvious to all, in a relationship with a God in whom there is no darkness or violence or judgment whatsoever. Brother David Stendhal Rast has a wonderful reflection on this. He says, and I quote, "Sometimes people get the mistaken notion that spirituality is a separate department of life, the penthouse of existence. But rightly understood, it is a vital awareness that pervades all realm of our being." End of quote. In other words, our spirituality has to be something that is total. It has to be something that affects the way we breathe, the way we talk, the way we walk down the street, the way we look at people, the way we do the simplest tasks. It has to be obvious to all. It has to be a way of life. The resurrection is a way of life. And what is very important is to realize it's not something we just experience after we die. And that's probably one of the most dangerous things that we've ever done, is to take the resurrection and push it into the hereafter. It is something that begins today. Christ is risen indeed, but we still need to move beyond our comfort zone and meet him where he promised to meet us. He was Galilee for the first followers, but it's the turmoil and insecurity of everyday earthly life for us. He meets us there, and he meets us in our own hearts and souls. We ask ourselves a question. Are we alive or dead? Are we grateful for the gift of life? Do we see the beauty and good in others and in the world? Are we grateful and generous? Do we strive to ease the burdens of others and to make the world a more loving, just, and peaceful place? There is a broken, fearful, and bleeding world that is desperate for healing and transformation. As I said, the resurrection is not only about what happens to us after death, it's what happens to us in this life. Too much is at stake for the resurrection of Christ to be transformed into dogma and creed and pushed into the life after death. Jesus did not come into this world and rise from the dead in order to be worshipped and kept at arm's length. He came to be followed, to be imitated. The risen Christ is always on the move. and he's always at work. Where are we? Are we just along for the ride? Or have we become co-workers in God's kingdom? It's very important for us not to be numbered among the dead before our time. Death will come to us all someday, but we have to make sure that our heart stops beating before we are numbered with the dead. The angels tell the women not to look for Jesus there, in a tomb amongst the dead. Look for him in God's Spirit blowing through the world and blowing through human hearts and giving hope to a fearful world. There's a prayer that the Christophers, a group that has given itself to illuminating people and touching minds and hearts since the end of the Second World War. It was founded by Father Keller on the principle, it is better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. And it goes like this. It's addressed to God. God, a few years ago, some people were saying that you were dead. Some still claim they can't be sure or can't be bothered. Some are torn and racked with doubt. Some of us who believe aren't very good proof of your compassion for humanity. Let us show more love so that your praises may be sung in every home, on every continent. Amen. God bless you. Christ is risen.
You have been listening to The Bottomless Well, hosted by Father Scott Lewis, here on Radio Maria Canada, a Catholic voice wherever you are.